So in this session, we're going to talk about vernacular Bibles. Bibles written in common language people spoke as opposed to the church Latin of the Vulgate. The majority of the world back then was illiterate. Mm-hmm. Right? We think of this as this major revolution, but how much really changed for most people who couldn't read the Bible anyway? What did it mean for the Bible to now be available in a language that they, frankly, still couldn't read?
Yeah. Yes.
Just a different one.
Yes. I think there's a number of aspects to this question. First of all, beginning with Luther in 1522, when he translates Erasmus's New Testament into German, apparently in 11 weeks while he was in the Wartburg castle. I mean, he creates... we spoke about the importance of the 1516 Erasmus New Testament, but, Luther now creates an extraordinarily beautiful version of the New Testament in German. The Old Testament would follow afterward. But he has this text in which he puts into German, in the language of the people actually spoke. And what I mean by that is not just the vernacular, but with the very way in which people addressed one another, spoke to each other in the street. Luther is said that he went out into the streets and into the homes of people to capture the language. Mm-hmm. So that this translation for him, as it was for Huldrych Zwingli in Zurich, and as it is for Tyndall in English, it wasn't just a matter of putting it into the vernacular, but it was a matter of putting it into the language that the people really spoke.
So it's the difference, it would be the difference today between what we think of as sort of biblical, sort of flowery King Jamesian.
Yes.
We'll get there. But for us today, the King James reads like the Bible.
Yes.
Right? It's biblical English.
Yes.
But what you're saying is that Luther and others weren't translating it into biblical German. They were translating it into something more like what we think of as with the ESV or the NIV, right? These modern, more colloquial translations.
And so the point was to have the language as people spoke it, and Luther was very clear that this was the way in which it was intended to be, that the Bible should be the language of the people because it was for them. And this is what he says, the Bible is for the people. Now you bring up the question of literacy. Very few of those people could actually read. But there's a couple of points that need to be brought out. Just as in late medieval culture, people had access to Scripture who didn't necessarily have the ability to read, so too in the Reformation time, you heard the word read in worship. This is something that the reform of worship in the Reformation brings about. Scripture is being read. So people hear it. Mm-hmm. They hear sermons on it. Preaching is made central to the worship of the Reformation churches. So there are a variety of ways. In addition, with the production of Bibles, you get, for instance, both in Zurich and with the 1534 Luther Bible, which comes with 117 woodcuts by Cranach, so that the biblical text is not just words, but it's also visual. Mm-hmm. So there's a visual culture to the Reformation in which the Bible is being presented that goes alongside, the printed word. So you've got the Bible is being put into the language that the people can understand, so that when they hear it, it's their own voice, but they have also ways of seeing it. Mm-hmm. And the emphasis of the Reformation churches, both Reformed and Lutheran, is on education. So the hope is that increasingly people will be brought to a place where they can, at least at various levels, read Scripture.
So there's sort of an irony in that the production of vernacular, obviously literary translations, is very much a return in some senses to sort of an orality, right? And in that sense, very much in line with, sort of, as I think they intended, original, much, ancient experience of the Bible. I'm thinking back, thousands of years ago when there was even less literacy in the time when the Bible was produced, and people would hear it and engage with it, mostly orally in their own language, whether Hebrew or Greek, Aramaic, whatever it was. But the notion of, we will experience this in a, casual language as opposed to a sort of high register. That's the way that it would have been in ancient Israel when they were hearing
Yes.
the prophets, or
Yes.
or hearing the Pentateuch read to them.
Yes.
And so the Reformation sort of recaptures that, even with the recognition of illiteracy. Yeah, that's the way it was back in biblical
Yes.
times too.
Yes.
But we're experiencing it as oral literature first, but through the mechanism of translation into vernacular.
Yes, and I think you and I did a class where we had Bibles laid out in front of us, and those are wonderful moments to be able to open them up and look at them. But in some ways, they divide us quite strongly from that culture which produced them, where they were part of worship. They were in people's homes. They were precious possessions, but also they belong to a visual culture, a culture of worship. And so we can't think of these Bibles separated from the world in which they lived, because they occupied many different roles within that. And even the visual sight of a Bible was, for people, the presence of the Word. And
yeah, I mean, we have to, I think, remember that when we imagine these Reformation Bibles, we tend to think of these sort of magnificent, Gutenberg again, right? If you've seen it in a museum or here at the Beinecke, you see this magnificent thing, beautifully done. And yes, there were Bibles that looked like that, but in fact, part of the adventure of the printing press and the Reformation and the production of multiple vernacular texts was the Bible was suddenly available in multiple forms and formats. There were these magnificent large ones that you might see on a church, lectern.
Yes.
But there were also, all the smaller sizes down from there, and there were ones that had pictures and engravings, and ones that had glossaries and indices, and ones that had none of that and were, pocket-sized.
Yeah.
So this is another way in which the printing press really helped to alter the experience of the Bible.
That's right. Yes, the Bible could take numerous forms. As you say, there's the folios, which would often be used as lectern Bibles in church. They'd be used in worship or for study, but right down to pocket-sized Bibles, as you mentioned, which were used to smuggle Bibles, across the channel into England. Tyndall's Bible is being brought into England, in people's pockets or in bags. It's often merchants who were doing this. So the story of the Bible, or Calvin's Bibles being, or Bibles from Geneva being taken into France, basically smuggled in. So these Bibles have extraordinary lives, and the different formats in which they were produced indicated different ways in which the Bible. So obviously an octavo Bible would probably not have any kind of accompanying textual commentary. It would be used for people who were traveling. It would be used, as I say, to take across into hostile territory. But the Bible becomes not a fixed text in the sense that it can take various forms. And those various forms speak to the multiplicity of ways in which it lived in that culture.
And one of the forms that you sort of alluded to was that they were really interested in education also. So the Bible took on sort of a reference work kind of sense to it, as it became accompanied with glossaries and indices that would help, presumably clerics mostly, but also scholars and perhaps the literate lay reader to sort of make connections and get further into the Bible than simply the hearing of it.
Yes.
It's what we're talking about then is a Bible that goes from a sort of a very formal sense, perhaps in the medieval period, to one that plays multiple different roles across society in the Reformation period.
Yes, and I think take us back to the question of language. The vernacular Bible had a particular place. It was for the people. It was for the church. It was the way in which people could hear the word and be instructed, so that their lives could be transformed. And this was the way in which the vernacular Bibles in the 16th century were being used. They were the basis of sermons, all of these types of things. But vernacular Bibles were not the foundation for theological or doctrinal debate. There you had that existed on a different level. That was the level of the Greek, the Hebrew, and the Latin. And so although you find production of texts in translation, these other languages were where the theological debates took place, not with the vernacular, because the vernacular texts were for the people, for the service of the church.
One of the things that I think we tend to think with the Reformation is, well, the Reformation, with the rise of the vernacular, sort of effaces the Vulgate sort of from any existence or importance. Yeah. But in fact, that's not the case. The Vulgate, the Greek and the Hebrew, yes, but the Vulgate, which is really what we think of the Reformation as pushing back against, right? The Latin. The Vulgate remains a central part of the experience of the Bible in the church.
Absolutely. There is tremendous affection for the Vulgate. In the Lutheran Church, the Vulgate is revised according to the Greek and Hebrew, but it continues to be printed. It's printed in centers of the Reformed Church, in Geneva and in Zurich and in Basel. Why? Because for them, it remains the traditional Bible of the church. It has a certain authority for which they have a great deal of respect. They're producing these other Bibles, but when you look at these other Bibles, these other Latin translations, you'll find that they're using the vernacular. They're often coming back to the vernacular. The vernacular the Vulgate becomes the crucial Bible for the Council of Trent and what will become the established Catholic text. The Vulgate is used by the King James translators. And they talk about it in their preface. So its role in the Reformation is considerable.
We know that we had these magnificent translations, Luther and Tyndall and others, that didn't emerge out of just a person sitting in a room translating, though it may have only taken Luther 11 weeks. That's very good for him. But what was the situation in which they were working? Were they fighting against? Were they doing something that was seen as revolutionary? Something that was, or after Erasmus, was this more acceptable? What's the social context in which these translations are happening? Are they confronted by an authority that is trying to put them down? Tyndall, as I recall, right, does not survive his translation, as they say.
No, he does not. They're working. Sometimes they're working on their own. Frequently, there is an ideal that is expressed that the scholars should work as a group. So you get translations emerging in a variety of different ways. But for someone like Tyndall, he flees England and goes to Germany and begins his translation work in Cologne and then later in Worms and then comes to Antwerp. He's a man who's being chased and is a refugee, working on his own, producing a translation which is extraordinarily influential, and we should say something more about that. But he's under such pressure that he only is able to produce a New Testament, then a Pentateuch and Jonah. He dies before the rest of his translation work is even produced. It will not be printed till after he's gone. And so, as we've spoken about before, it is the culture of publish and perish. It is an extraordinarily dangerous world in which these people, many of them, lived. Luther was a different case, and Zwingli and his successors were also a different case, because they were in Wittenberg and Zurich, where they had established culture that could produce translations, and they had the backing of major printers who could make sure that those translations were disseminated broadly.
As we think about these translators, right, we take vernacular translations for granted, but it was difficult and it was dangerous work to do what they did. It's hard to sort of get our heads around what it would have meant to say, oh, you can't translate that. But thanks to sort of the work that they did, the Bible becomes much more broadly known and changes its features. And what we're going to talk about in our last sort of general session coming up about the Bible and the Reformation is sort of what the result of their work is, right? What was the Reformation Bible? That'll be the topic for our next session.